just to introduce who we are, my name is Rashida, like I said. I'm joined by members of SURJ, and that's Lisa Bennett, Chelsea Supowitz, Barbara Kohler, are our SURJ members who are on with us today. But we also are joined by panelists, Omar Carrera. He works with Canal Alliance, and Carolyn Peady, who works with Fair Housing Advocates of Northern California. So she is also going to be sharing with us some of her expertise, as Omar will be sharing his. Let's see, there's a couple of housekeeping things that I'm going to share with you. If you go to the Marin County Library website, you will see that there is a companion book list that we created for this event. On that companion book list are not just books that have to do with the topics we're discussing with demystifying affordable housing through a racial justice lens, but there are also links on that book list to the Canal Alliance, to Fair Housing Advocates of Northern California. So you can check out these organizations, and that's at marincountylibrary.org if you're interested in exploring that, getting more information about demystifying affordable housing. And I am going to let Barbara share a little bit about SURJ Marin.
Hi, my name is Barbara Kohler, and SURJ Marin is part of a national network of groups and people. The abbreviation SURJ stands for Showing Up for Racial Justice. And SURJ is a group of all people of all races and ethnicities that are welcome. The mission of SURJ is to mobilize, organize, and educate white people and bring them into the broader multiracial movement for racial justice. SURJ Marin follows the leadership of Black, Indigenous, people of color organizations and community leaders, and has accountability relationships with organizers and organizations of color. There are 3 accountability partners this year. They are the Multicultural Center of Marin, Marin City Arts and Culture, and the Marin County Cooperation Team. And I'm just going to take a few words from our values statement. We are here because white supremacy steals our humanity. We are here to reclaim our humanity and hold space for others to reclaim theirs. We want liberation for everyone. And for more information about SURJ Marin and about the events and to sign up for our newsletter, you can go to the website surjmarin.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Next, we're going to have Lisa come forward, and she's going to share with us a land acknowledgement and a land commitment. And I would like to add that the SURJ website is also available. You can access that from the book list for this web series. Lisa?
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. This is something that SURJ Marin does before all of its major events and its big meetings. It's a way to slow down and take in the richness of the past that has left us to this moment, and to ground ourselves truly in the earth, and to take action where action needs to be taken. So first, let's slow down, take a moment to breathe, ground yourself, the land, close your eyes if you need to, put your feet on the floor if you need to. And think about the soil. The soil outside is alive. Imagine it. Imagine the beauty of the land we are sitting on, and that engenders the lives we live today. Take a moment to think about what land acknowledgements mean to you personally as we gather today with intention. We acknowledge that we are living on stolen land, the homelands of the coastal Miwok people. For thousands of years, the Miwok have lived here in harmony with all animals, plants, and neighbors, believing all life has the right to inhabit the land. They have stewarded, nurtured, and honored this land. They continue to live with a deep spiritual connection to this land in the traditions of their ancestors. They raised their families here, celebrated births, marriages, mourned deaths. They have shared their knowledge and love of the land for hundreds of generations and continue to share it with us today. In return, we have exploited, poisoned, and scarred the land we stole. We now face a time when the future of the animals, plants, and life on this planet is in jeopardy. Native people are asking us to reconsider our land acknowledgements to include not just prayer, but action. It's in this spirit that I want to share with you a beautiful campaign that SURJ Bay Area is undertaking to rematriate land in the East Bay. They have purchased a home in the East Bay, which is held in trust to provide permanent, affordable housing to Indigenous people. The purchase now complete, they are now raising funds to repair the home and make it thrive as a sustainable, land-friendly structure. Please go to Rematriate the Land Fund and donate at your convenience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was very, very beautiful. And the link to the Rematriate the Land Trust is also on the book list. So I encourage you guys, we will be putting the links to these organizations also in the chat at the end of this program. So there will be 2 ways to access that information. Without further ado, we would like to start our film. Lisa will be sharing Race, the Power of an Illusion. This is a program that was run on PBS. And we're going to be watching the 3rd episode, which focuses on housing, the house we live in. If you guys have other questions about the PBS film, there are also links and resources on the book list that will allow you to explore more of the episodes, explore the concepts covered in those episodes. And of course, all of the episodes are available on Canopy, which you can access through the Marin County Library website. Okay, Lisa? That's powerful stuff. I was first exposed to Race, the Power of an Illusion, working with California libraries cultivating race, racial equity, and inclusion, CRAE. We have a group of libraries and library staff from all over California meeting to learn about some of these inequities for our regions, studying the racial history that have put these inequities into place, and working as library staff to start dismantling some of those political and economic decisions which created this unfair society. So when they showed that, for me, this video was very much a eye-opening thing where I was able to see, oh, that's how we got here. And this was part of our basis and our reason for choosing this video and for starting this series, because we truly believe that this housing issue is fundamental to a lot of the inequities that we see. And I think that was very clearly pointed out in the video. It says who has a seat at the table, who has what jobs, where are they able to live, where do their children go to school, is it a good school or a bad school? All of those things hinges on where we live. And so we are now going to hear from panelists who I will reintroduce, and I will start with Carolyn. She's going to introduce herself a little first, and then I will introduce Omar, and Omar will share a little bit about the work that he's doing as well. So to start us off, Carolyn Peady has been working with working in the fair housing field since 1987. She's the executive director of Fair Housing Advocates of Northern California and has been with the organization since 1996. Prior to her association with Fair Housing Advocates, she was the executive director of Sentinel Fair Housing in Oakland, and she has been a board member of the National Fair Housing Alliance since 2009. Carolyn has a great deal of experience with answering the questions of how we got here with affordable housing historically, and she has a deep understanding of the legal, economic, and social decisions that shut people of color out of housing in this country. So she will begin with a discussion on the history of housing segregation, and Carolyn, please feel free to share a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your perception as we're working with this topic of demystifying affordable housing through a racial justice lens. Carolyn, welcome.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that introduction, Rashida, and I'm happy to be talking with you all about something that is very near and dear to my heart. I don't want to talk too much about myself. I mean, I've been in the fair housing field since 1987 and have had a chance to, and it's really kind of amazing after all this time, how much I'm learning all the time about fair housing and the way it intersects with all the things we've just been talking about, the housing opportunities that we get, that we have based on where we live. So I'm gonna share, see if I can do a good job of sharing my screen. And can somebody give me a vocal? You can see like one screen of a PowerPoint. Can somebody give me a heads up on that?
We see it.
Okay, great. And I just wanted to say that, you know, some of what I'm saying is going to sound very familiar based on the film we just saw, and the idea is to that I'm gonna talk a little bit about sort of the broader history, that just touch on that, and then bring it down to the local level. I've had the opportunity to work on fair housing issues both at the local and the state and the national level, and so it's really helped my perspective in many ways and see how things play out in our neighborhoods. So let me just start with I'm gonna talk about, I'm just going to give you a little where I'm going. I'm going to talk about the history of social engineering and racial segregation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about racial segregation, how it led to racial segregation in Marin today. I'm going to show you an interactive segregation map that was done by the Othering and Belonging Institute, and I will actually drop the link into the chat when a little bit later, even if I probably can't do it while I've got these slides up. And then, and in fact, the Othering and Belonging Institute is where John Powell, one of the speakers of the film, he heads up the Othering and Belonging Institute. And then I think maybe not right now, but maybe later on as we get into discussions, I can talk a little bit about RHNA allocations. And just to be clear, the RHNA stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and that's about how we develop housing and affordable housing. And I'm going to talk about RHNA allocations, racial equity, and affordable housing. So let's get to the history of racial segregation in Marin County by starting with a slightly broader view. I'm going to talk about this idea of social engineering and segregation. Under FDR's New Deal, the federal government subsidized white families to move into suburbs, and you were hearing about this on the film. They offered low-cost loans and access to affordable home ownership to whites, but not to Black families. And from the 1930s to the 1960s, we saw a couple of different types of housing discrimination, and they talked a good bit about, you know, many of these types of housing discrimination. One was de facto, or that's, you know, redlining, steering, restrictive covenants, and blockbusting, and they covered all of those types of discrimination. And then there's de jure discrimination, which is separation that is enforced by law through very explicit racially conscious government policies. And we heard about that as well. That kind of, basically discriminatory policies that are de jure discrimination, as well as de facto types of discrimination, continues, and discriminatory housing policies still exist today. So banks and insurance companies continued policies of redlining neighborhoods of color, which, as you saw, effectively denied loans or insurance for homes in those neighborhoods. And prior to the economic recession of 2008, mortgage lenders targeted communities of color with unaffordable subprime loans or reverse redlining. So many people of color could have qualified for and afforded prime loans, but were put into subprime unaffordable loans. And of course, that's another way of, leaching equity and wealth from people of color. The mortgage crisis also, I'll just say that from 2008 to the present, communities of color were impacted further through bank failure to maintain and market bank-owned properties. And when I say bank-owned properties, I'm talking about properties that were foreclosed upon. The mortgage crisis impacted communities of color the most. When homes were foreclosed upon, credit scores were ruined, families were displaced, borrowers lost down payment and equity. So another way in which equity was leached. And then, this idea of poorly maintained foreclosed properties caused declining property values, invited crime, affected physical and mental health of neighbors. I will just tell you that our organization is involved in 3 different lawsuits that involve the failure of this discrimination in the maintaining and marketing of homes in communities of color versus white communities. And I had the delight of getting deposed for those very same lawsuits in a few weeks. In terms of then coming back to Marin County, I think some of you probably are familiar with this history, but the history of Marin City is a very local example of how government policies and practices created segregated communities. Until World War II in 1941, there were very few Black people who lived in Marin County. But during World War II, Marin Ship was created and built nearly 100 ships and tankers. And housing, of course, was developed for its workers, creating the unincorporated community of Marin City. There weren't enough workers, so Black Americans were recruited from the South, from Louisiana, from Arkansas, from Texas, and Oklahoma. And at its peak in 1944, Marin Ship employed 22,000 workers from every state in the country. Marin City had a population of 6,500 people, and it was the first integrated housing project. It was 85% white, 10% Black, and 5% Chinese. Now, when the war ended, military veterans returned in droves. You heard all about how there were VA loans that were accessible to white families. Housing was in very short supply. Families were doubling up. And because there was such a large civilian housing shortage, the National Housing Act of 1949 was created. White families whites who were returning from World War II were able to purchase homes with mortgages that were guaranteed by the federal government. And homes in Marin in the late 1940s were selling for $7,000 to $8,000. I mean, I gotta say, I love that. I love that number. And white families often got mortgages with 0 to 5% down. And of course, as you all know, today those homes are worth over $1 million, right? So white families, as they emphasized in the movie, had opportunities to use the equity in their homes to send their kids to college or bequeath their wealth to future generations. And those were opportunities that most Black families did not have. They didn't have access to the loans. They were shut out because of restrictive covenants from moving out of Marin City. They remained in substandard housing in Marin City without the opportunity to accumulate wealth that they could hand down through generations. Now, keep in mind that the Fair Housing Act was passed in April of 1968 following the assassination of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And as a result, his death was the reason why the Fair Housing Act was passed. And that gave Black and Latinx families the right to buy into the housing of their choice, but they didn't have any economic means now of doing so, right? Because now those homes have been appreciating and appreciating and appreciating, getting more and more expensive. According to the Brookings Institute, as of 2020, African Americans have less than 60% of what white families have in income. And in 2019, the median white household held 7.8 times the wealth that of the typical Black household. So when you look at there was rising demand and therefore price of housing and shrinking supply of affordable housing, and that affects the most vulnerable people, which are disproportionately people of color, families with children, people with disabilities, the very same people that fair housing laws were meant to protect. Now, the reason why I mentioned this idea of social segregation and why I have mentioned why I included it in some of my slides is when people say that, well, HUD or the federal government shouldn't be telling cities and towns what they should do with their federal funds, or require that they build affordable housing because it's social engineering, as though that's a bad thing. It absolutely is social engineering, and it should be. There should be social engineering to reverse all those decades and decades of social engineering that caused the segregated living patterns that we see today. So let's talk about the racial segregation that we see today. And as we go along, just keep in mind this historical context. According to race counts, Marin is home to the largest inequities between racial groups of any county in California. And they determined that a big part of that were the disparities in home ownership rates and housing costs between white, Black, and Latinx people. The life expectancy of Marin County overall is 85 years. In Marin City, the life expectancy is 80 years. In the Canal, it's 76. Now, remember that whole idea of where you live is directly correlated to the resources you have access to. I'll just mention that in other parts of the country, these gaps are even higher, and in some very stark ways. So some quick stats about Marin City. As of 2017, Black people represent only 2% of Marin's population, but 30% of Marin City. Marin City is only 24% white. And between 2010 and 2017, the population of Marin City increased by almost 14%. If you look at the racial distribution in Marin City, and you look at who is being pushed out, this graph highlights sort of racially segregated patterns. And if you look at particularly at the percentage of Black residents in Marin City, you start to get a picture of who is being pushed out. And this is the lighter pink is 2010, and the I don't know what color that is, but the light, sort of darker orange is 2017. Okay. And the Canal, I know that Omar is going to be talking more about the Canal, but just a couple of quick stats is that as of 2017, Latinx people represented only 16% of Marin's population, but 78% of the Canal. And there was, as you can see, in 2017, there was a 277% increase in African-American households living in the Canal since 2010. In 2017, the median household income for Marin residents was almost $105,000 in the Canal. Just over 4% of the residents earned within that range. And by the way, I'll just say that in terms of the count of Latinx folks, that could be an undercount due to the undocumented community. And then last but not least, I wanted to show you this Bay Area segregation map, and I will try to drop this, the link in the chat. It's a great interactive map, and you can see this red area here where that's Marin is. Red is the high segregation color of this map. And I'm going to see if I can copy this link right now.
I already dropped the link into the chat.
Fantastic.
I've
Great.
got you covered.
All right. Well, thank you. That's perfect. And I think I'll stop here because I think past the time of that has been allotted, but I'm more than happy to talk later on about how affirmatively furthering fair housing and the RHNA allocations, the regional housing needs allocation that I mentioned earlier, are related. And I'll just, the one thing I want to mention here before I stop is that this is a really crucial point, is that the US and the Bay Area is now more segregated than it was before the Fair Housing Act was passed. So I want to just pause for a second and then let that sink in and just repeat that we're talking about the Fair Housing Act that was passed in 1968. The US and Bay Area is more segregated than it was before the Fair Housing Act was passed. And it's also, I'll just also say that that's related to that is the fact that homeownership gap also is similar to what it was before the Fair Housing Act was passed. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Absolutely.
We will have a Q&A period at the end where you will have a chance to ask some questions. We'll be able to ask some questions of our panelists. And I would like to add that our next program in the series is titled Why is Marin So White? And we're going to be covering some of these same things, and we're going to be hearing from local leaders, and we're going to be discussing some of this more in depth. So stay tuned. But next I would like to introduce Omar Carrera. He is a social entrepreneur, human rights advocate, strategic visionary with more than 18 years experience in business operation management in the nonprofit and for-profit sectors. Omar is currently serving as the CEO of Canal Alliance. Omar has been helping people of color navigate many of the housing policy barriers in our region. Right now, he's going to share his insights on how policy has been impacting our housing crisis. And without further ado, welcome, Omar. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rashida. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Omar Carrera, CEO of Canal Alliance. And if you don't know anything about Canal Alliance, we exist to break the generational cycle of poverty for Latino immigrants and their families by lifting barriers to their success. We have been serving the immigrant community and their families for almost 40 years now. I would like just to start, sharing how I feel after watching the film and listening to Carolyn. By the way, everything they're laying around policy, housing policy, has been through Carolyn's organization. Attend their conferences, their events, they're very educational. Especially for me, because I'm an immigrant. I moved to the United States in 2002, and I didn't know why we have so many inequities in a country that has so many resources, right? And it really took me a while to understand the role of policies, that we have in our society at the local, the state, and national level. They contribute to that segregation, they contribute to that inequities. I want to just really recognize we can change that if we really tackle the problem in a different way. And always, it sparked interest to me when people were saying, this is a systemic issue, this is a systemic problem. And I said, well, if there's a systemic problem, why we don't just change the whole system? And it was very hard for me to understand what is that we were referring to when we talk about systemic issues. So I really was interested in unpacking that idea of a systemic problem and really understanding what are the elements of that system, right? And one of them are policies. Policies that are making the problem worse, or the lack of policies, right? Then you have policymakers, people who represent us, who have the capacity to change those policies if they have the political willingness. And then there is voters, us, that we put those policymakers in power, right, to represent us. So when we talk about the systemic issue, it's all those three elements that we need to pay attention. Yes, it's policies, but we have policymakers that could change those policies, and we are the ones voting for them every single time to put them in power. So we need to hold them accountable. We need to make sure that the people who are representing us really have our agenda front and center. And if it's not, then we need to be looking for different people to represent us during election times. The numbers, continue to increase in not just Latinos, but in general, but, talking about Latinos, the census data that we saw, it was clear, a huge growth of Latinos in the country, in the state of California. Right now, we're talking about 4 or 10 Americans will identify as Latinos. And that is the reason why we have the Trump administration really attacking the census from the beginning. It was an agenda based on fear, because they knew, in 2010, they knew that the white community was declining and the Latino community was growing. In fact, if you go back to the headlines of the news in 2010, you will read a lot about the Latino boom. And the main trigger of that growth was not migration, it was birth. And that's something that we don't talk enough about. There's a lot of US citizens, Latino US citizens, who are transforming this country as well. And it's for in the census, in the 2020 census, it was for the first time we saw in the nation a decline of the white population in numbers. And that is really created a lot of fear, especially in the white agenda with national groups. And that's why they look at the census as a place where they can go and attack, create fear, prevent people's participation, because that was the solution for them, instead of embracing that diversity. And they were somehow successful, preventing for people to participate in the census. And even though that we have that, we still were able to show the growth of the Latino community across the country. And I think that is just something that we need to keep in mind, because Latinos now are your workforce. Latinos are going to be the people, they are going to be, they are already contributing to the economy right now. If they are the future of this country, we need to really make sure that we invest on them. And one thing that I want to add in terms of the role of housing in people's lives and people's opportunities also is education, right? We're living in a society where your socioeconomic status define how long you live, where you live, what opportunities you have, and income is connected to education. So if we have an education system that's not serving students of color, we have an economic problem. And I always like to see this more as an economic problem than a social problem, because it is an economic problem. Now, going back to housing, I want to recognize that we had a crisis before the pandemic. What the pandemic did is highlighted the social and economic issues that we were facing before the pandemic. Then the housing crisis during the pandemic has just become worse, right? And right along the health crisis, it was being an economic crisis being built on it. A lot of essential workers were taking higher risks to work in order to feed their kids. So they were out more than any other groups. And also many other jobs were not able to be converted into remote jobs. So they needed to still work throughout the pandemic. They have been in the front lines since they want. We did a calculation with some partner organizations that we identified that we have in Marin County around over 10,000 households that were at an imminent risk of being evicted. And these are the households that were impacted by the economic crisis, unemployment and reduced of their income. And within those 10,000 households, we were talking about over 8,000 children. So we were in 2020, in addition to the health crisis, we were going to have a social crisis. They were still not even to understand it. And so what contributed to that crisis? Why the housing crisis got worse? Well, we watched through the film the reasons why. We heard through Carolyn's presentation the reasons why. But really, I would like just to summarize that, right? We have a long history of community opposition against housing, any housing. We have a strict zoning and land use policies that restrict density and housing production. And we have a very strong environmental argument that we always use to prevent housing development. I always had to remind people that in Marin County, 85% of the land is protected. So we only have 15% to build. And that 15% is already, most of that is built. So we really have few opportunities that we should be prioritizing for housing for the workforce. I don't think we need more multi-million homes in Marin County. What the pandemic did, it forced us to work together with a shared goal, right? It was a global crisis that required a collective response. And we were lucky to actually have elected officials, to have city and county staff that were able to create a space for all of us to work together. We understood that we want to reopen the economy, we want to reopen the schools. We needed to support our essential workers. We needed to create programs to respond to the health and economic crisis that disproportionately impacted these communities. And we need to do things differently. We created a group called Canal Policy Working Group. It's a group of elected officials. We have the mayor of San Rafael participating in this, the Supervisor Rodonic, who represents the district. We have Councilwoman Amaika, who represents our city district. And we have city and county staff and 3 organizations, Canal Alliance, Community Action Marine, and Legal Marine. So together we have been able to analyze potential short-term solutions that we needed to implement to help the essential workers. Because we remember in 2020, the vaccine was still a thought. We didn't have a clear idea about how long the pandemic is going to be. But we were able to see month over month, the people's death was accumulating very fast, and people were desperate. So with the advocacy in this group, we were able to actually extend the eviction moratorium even before the state of California. We did it twice. We are supporting currently the rental assistance program for Marin. And that program, you know, despite all the challenges that that program or the funding structure of that program has created, we still are trying to help the community, but I'm not at the pace that we all thought was going to happen. Because the funding program that was created by the state and federal government, they didn't take into account that we serve a lot of the subtenants. So these programs are intended to serve people who are holding the lease, not people who are sub-renting on the lease. And the other thing that we are proud of the work that we did with this group was that we were able to freeze the rents and the census tract in the canal. As I mentioned, these are essential workers. Most of them are working in the service industry, and that's one of the industries that has been disproportionately impacted. And we're still trying to understand what is going to be in the phase of the transitioning from crisis to recovery. What are the new jobs that we need to be thinking? What are the new skills that we need to be incorporating in our trainings to help people transition to those new jobs that are being created in a post-pandemic economy? Now, the question and reflection that I always ask myself, you know, why did it have to wait a pandemic to do all of this, to work together, to create solutions, to implement policies, to understand if 1% of a community is not safe, then nobody will be safe. Why we had to wait and have so many losses. You know, we lost a lot of people, friends, family through this pandemic. And these socioeconomic issues were contributors to that crisis. So the question here is, you know, what is the society that we all envision? What is the economy that we all envision? We should all work together to build. You know, this is an opportunity to do this. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have and how to create this more just society, this more inclusive economy. This is an opportunity for all of us to work together towards that goal. Thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Omar. We would like to take some time to ask questions of our panelists, and then we'd like to hear from our audience, and we'll open it up for some Q&A. But right now, we'll just start by asking some questions. Omar, I think I'd like to start this off by asking you, we like to think that anyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps in America. What difference does that access to affordable housing and financial resources make?
Thank you, Rashid. I mean, housing is the center of everything, right? Without the stable housing, we cannot do anything around education. We cannot do anything around workforce development. We cannot do anything. If people don't have a stable housing, nothing happens. So that's the center of family stability, of economic stability. So we need to tackle that. Now, the opportunity is very complex, right? We have been preventing housing development for a long time, and now we have a pandemic on top of it. Finding a solution to resolve the housing crisis is not going to be easy. So we really need to tackle this in multiple ways: short-term and long-term policies, developing housing, acquiring existing properties. Right now they are in the market, to convert them into affordable housing. So we really need to tackle this in a very comprehensive approach. Now, there are conversations about we need more housing in segregated communities, right? Because if there is a land opportunity there, we want to maybe build more housing, but there's people thinking, do we need to build more housing that will contribute to the segregation of those communities? Or do we need to build housing somewhere else, wherever it is, so that people can actually move? And it's a very complex question, yeah. And then you have other factors like the pandemic, of course, but you have the drought. And all of those factors, they make housing development more complicated. So it's what we need to do. We need to really try to resolve the housing instability, because without that, nothing else will happen. It's not going to be a recovery, and we're going to be trapped in this for a long time. So it plays a crucial role to helping someone escape poverty, to helping someone connect with opportunities. Housing is the front and center. I personally believe the education, health, and housing should not be put in the market. You know, like the market should not be deciding who have access to high quality education, high quality healthcare, and stable housing. The market should not be stable in that. That is a government responsibility, and they should be responding to it accordingly to it.
Thank you. I really appreciate your sharing that. I know earlier when we were talking, just the SURJ and Marin County folks, Marin County Free Library folks were talking. You mentioned that we need to recenter kind of our viewpoint. We often talk about segregation in a viewpoint of, you know, segregated communities are Black communities, segregated communities are Latino communities, but we really need to refocus that and say segregated communities are white communities, and they've been segregated for a reason. And I really appreciated that. And I think that touches on and adds to what you're just saying, that we need to address the segregation in white communities. How did that get to be there, and how can we change that? And I think it speaks to all of the things that you just mentioned. Thank you so much. Carolyn, I think my next question is going to be for you. Why should white people be concerned about the wealth gap? How do we as a society address this issue?
Thanks for that question. I mean, in some ways, there's so many different ways to answer that. By the way, I was remiss. I should have you gave me the opportunity to say something about my organization. And for those people who do not know what Fair Housing Advocates of Northern California does, I'm going to just take like 30 seconds to mention that we offer not only fair housing counseling for people who feel that they have experienced discrimination. We help people with disabilities with their disability-related housing needs. And we also help people who are having difficulty or thinking that maybe they're facing foreclosure or they've got mortgage delinquency. We do, we counsel, we have a foreclosure prevention counseling program. We also do pre-purchase counseling. And for those people who have housing discrimination complaints, we will actually do, not only we'll investigate their complaints as well. And something that I'll just say that we're always looking for people who can act as what we call testers, and those are people that we hire on just sort of an on-call as needed basis as complaints come up to investigate housing discrimination. We train them, and if they go out and we'll do comparisons between, for example, a white person and a Black person. How are they treated when they're out there trying to access housing? So I just wanted to mention that in case any of you are interested in testing, or you know somebody who is, then absolutely you should get in touch with us. Okay, well now, because I have a brain like a sieve, your question was about your question was about why should white people be concerned about, and let me just make sure that I got this right. Why should white people be concerned about the wealth gap, and why
Yes.
we as a society should address this issue? So I guess, you know, I've got multiple answers aside from the moral imperative, which seems pretty obvious to me, and I'm assuming it seems pretty obvious to everybody who is interested enough to attend this event today. I think the other thing that is really important to think about is that you can't, I mean, by the way, from my personal, my personal opinion is that you are living in a pretty sterile environment if everybody looks like you, acts like you, thinks like you. I worry sometimes actually about that, given the fact that we're in the Bay Area, and it's a very different mindset than people in lots of other parts of the country. And of course, I feel lucky about that in many respects. But the other thing that I think is really crucial to think about is that when people, you know, I think what happens in white communities that are sort of separate, and they, you know, particularly like gated communities, really affluent areas, and the sense of like, this is our space and everything outside, there's a tendency to sort of blame people for being poor and blaming people for poverty, and it's like that's something other than, that's not our, you know, we've got our own space here, that you are just perpetuating, you know, I mean, if you want to lift everybody up, then we're all going to be better off. You know, you want crime and to be lessened. Well, then give opportunities to people who are committing the crimes so that they don't have to commit crimes, because they're not, you know, because they're steeped in poverty and so on and so forth, because they haven't been able to have been given any opportunities. So there's that sense of like, lift everybody up, and all of us get to then enjoy the fruits of everybody doing better. You know, there's this tendency to think in terms of like, if I give somebody over here, if I lift them up, that somehow it's going to be taking away from me. And that's not the case at all. I mean, there's so much evidence out there that shows that you increase, you know, wealth and resources for everybody, it increases, you know, it basically increases the overall well-being of the entire community.
Excellent. Thank you. I love that point. Something that we discussed in cultivating race equity and inclusion in libraries here in Marin and in libraries across California was the cut curb effect, where if you make a policy, you know, we all see those, you know, cut curbs where, you know, it's supposed to be wheelchair accessible, so people in wheelchairs can get onto a curb or to leave a curve and cross the street. It wasn't just people who, you know, fall under ADA protections who benefited from that. Everyone benefited from taking that consideration and making it available to other people. Moms with strollers, people with luggage, people who are loading and unloading for, you know, businesses.
People who didn't have to trip over the curb and like break their nose or whatever.
Exactly. And everybody benefited from making these concessions, let's call them concessions, to the fact that there are people who need, because of the being historically shut out of these neighborhoods, they need concessions. And when we offer those concessions, everyone benefits, not just the people who those concessions were made for. So that, I think that I love that you brought that in, that everybody benefits from this. Omar, I would like to ask you the next question. 32 entities in California have declared that racism is a public health crisis. Marin is not one of them. So that's an interesting little note. How do you see the connection between systemic racism, public health, and our housing crisis as interrelated?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. You know, I always tell people that Marin County always vote blue and act purple, right? And I think we need to own that. Why we don't do that? You know, I mean, it seems to me common sense, right? But unfortunately, there's a lot of things that are not common, neither sense anymore in our society. I would say the public health strategy during 2020 in response to the pandemic failed, right? It failed because government and philanthropy working away, they think they are the experts in communities, and they create these programs to respond to crisis or to respond to the needs of communities, and it failed, right? And what Marin County was able to realize is that in order to reopen the entire county for everyone, we needed to focus on communities of color that were the ones disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, right? Due to socioeconomic aspects of it, poverty, inequities, and all that. But they understood for the first time that if we want to reopen the schools, if we want to reopen the economy, we needed to go and support those communities. And now, when you see the vaccination rate so high in low-income communities in Marin County, higher than any other county in the state and the country, is due to that mobilization and collective effort and willingness from government to change how we operate, right? So when we're talking about racism being a public health issue, what we need to do is recognize that there is racism in Marin County, right? There is segregated community in Marin County, that we have issues in our education system, that we have issues in everything, right? Every time, and I'm a big supporter of public school, but when people come and tell me public education in Marin County is good, I say, yeah, it's good. My kids went through it and they benefit from it. But depending on the race of the color of your skin, your experience in that same education system will be different, right? And I think we need to really recognize that just writing a resolution, that's saying that we welcome immigrants, or that we care about immigrants, or that we care about people of color, or even having a full month to celebrate my ethnicity, Hispanic. We are doing the Hispanic Heritage Month. And that month, we're going to celebrate the contributions, or music, or cuisine, everything, art. Honestly, I'm grateful that we have a month to celebrate, but I will be more grateful if we celebrated in that month, we were able to overcome all the inequities that was affecting the Latino community, right? I hope that one day we can have a day or a month to celebrate that we as a society has overcome inequities for groups of color, and not just our contributions that we make. So yeah, I think this is a call to action, right? This is a call to action, and I hope I'm optimistic despite everything that we're going through. Our public health officers that we have in Marin County understand the importance of seeing this as an opportunity to change how we operate around public health, right? The segregation, the lack of access to housing, the lack of access to high quality jobs, all of that have contributed to the health crisis that we are facing right now. So how many more pandemics do we need to go through and to understand that we have to do things differently? I don't know, but I'm optimistic that maybe this is the opportunity for us to do things differently.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yes. I think this COVID-19 epidemic, pandemic was really opened our eyes in a lot of ways to the ways that we are so connected. All of us are connected, and all of us are dependent upon how well each of us are doing, but especially how well those who have been most marginalized are doing. When they are protected, when they are given health care, when they have their needs addressed, everyone is healthier. And by focusing on that, I think Marin did push to make sure that people had access to vaccines as soon as those were available. But, what about healthcare once the pandemic's over? Do they have access to those resources, those predictive things that ensure that they're coming into the next pandemic? I pray that that's not an issue, but they're coming into the next pandemic healthy and not facing twice the risks that their white counterparts are. So I really appreciate your statement there. I have one more question, and then we would love to open it up, and we'll start reading some of the questions for chats. Thank you. Sorry, I was trying to answer questions or ask questions of our panelists while kind of keeping an eye on the chat. But if you have questions, please do populate the chat, and then we'll go from that to start asking questions of our panelists. My last question here is to both of you, Omar and Carolyn. If we do nothing to address the net worth wealth gap, will it go away on its own, or will it continue to grow? And just would like to hear some of your thoughts about why. Carolyn, why don't you start us off?
I can start, because I think one of the last things that I said after my presentation is that if you look at the homeownership gap, I mentioned that if you look at the homeownership gap and it's worse today, or as bad today as it was before the Fair Housing Act was passed. Well, that gives you a good indication of what the answer to your question might be.
Absolutely.
And the other thing is that all of the things that we've been talking about around the opportunities that you have, based on where you live, and when you own your own home, that gives you all of these. It just opens up a whole wealth of opportunities for you, right? Because if you have equity in your home and you can start, that is the biggest way that we tend to build wealth in this country, and that allows people, for example, to like I said, you can send your kids to college such that they don't come out of having an education with crushing student debt, right? And that all of those things around, like, that gives you so many different opportunities. So it's very clear to me that it's one of those things where we've seen it in this country, right? Wealth begets wealth, and during the past bunch of years, and particularly you've seen it in the last certainly during the Trump years, that all of this whole idea of the trickle-down theory, I'm sorry, it has not been working. The trickle-down theory seems to be kind of a trickle-up theory, really. And so I just think that we need to do something very affirmatively to address the wealth gap in ways that, if we don't do something about it in a very, very active way, we're going to continue to see the same inequalities, or worse, or worse. What we do know is that that certainly there's a huge gap. The wealth are getting wealthier, the poor people, poor are getting poorer, and so there has to be a way of sort of leveling things out in a way. It goes back to that whole concept of social engineering that I was talking about. It has to happen, and it has to happen in order to make the positive changes that we need.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carolyn.
Wow.
Omar, same question. If we do nothing to address the net worth wealth gap, what will it go away on its own or continue to grow, and why do you think so?
Yeah, I'm a believer that nothing happened by accident. That's not going to be resolved by itself unless we really change the whole ecosystem, they contribute towards that gap. And go back to policy. We really need to hold accountable to our government. They need to really create the framework to create opportunities for people who have been segregated from those opportunities. Right? We need to change that. We need to also hold accountable to the private institutions who are contributing to this, or banks. Where do you have your money? Just ask them. There is a report from banks. They say how much loans they have provided to people of color. So where are you putting your money? Where are you doing your business? We need to start raising those questions ourselves, because if your money is going to an institution that's contributing to this, what they call it, redlining, issues, then you are part of the problem, right? So if you are voting for an elected official who affordable housing is not a priority, you are part of the problem. That gap is not going to get closed, right? And also, we live in a system, the capitalism, is created to maximize revenue and to accumulate wealth and then protect that wealth, right? They don't get distributed. So that is our society. We live like that. So it's not going to happen by accident. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it can happen, right? If all of us start working together, electing people that really represent us, they have that vision. We need elected officials who focus on the next generations and not just in the next elections. And I always hear from people coming and saying that they care about people of color, and they come and they join our events and they support us and give us the love. And I still don't see that policy change happening, right? So the love is not there yet to make it happen, and we need to get there. I think government defines the tone, defines the priorities of what is we want to see in our community. And how do they show us that they are real about it is with policies.
Excellent.
Can I add one more thing to that, which is that the way, you know, one of the things that we've talked about in terms of wealth, I mean, there's lots of, you know, ways in which we can, we've been talking about home ownership but having access to any kind of affordable housing is going to make a huge difference in terms of whether we are able to accumulate wealth. I didn't really talk about this a whole lot, but there is, you know, there's a provision of the Fair Housing Act that says this concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing, right? That is provision of the Fair Housing Act to actively address racial segregation and to undo lasting harms that are created and sustained by government. And you know, the regional housing needs allocation that I was talking about that is put forth by the you know, that it was decided for our region by the Associated Bay Area government. Is a big part of like what's going to happen with that is and how that plays out over the coming years is really going to make a difference in terms of how, you know, what kind of opportunities and access people have to affordable housing. And the RHNA, or the Regional Housing Neighborhood Allocation, is meant to increase the housing supply, have a mix of housing types in an equitable way, and balance existing disproportionate concentrations of income categories by, you know, increasing lower income allocations in white exclusionary suburbs and avoiding, you know, gentrification of lower income neighborhoods and so on. And that's all about affirmatively furthering fair housing. So I'll just say that, you know, when you see things happening in your neck of the woods around affordable housing, and think about how you might lend your voice to make things more equitable in your neighborhood, that's something that I think is so important. Like, make your voice heard. It's a really, really important piece of it. So thanks for letting me go on that rant for a moment.
Absolutely. I'm opening it up to questions now from the chat. I'm going to read a question that came through the chat to me. Marguerite, I saw that you had your hand up earlier. She has a couple of things to say. Mine is more of an observation. Glad to hear from Omar that City of San Rafael mayor and council person are involved. However, very little confidence if supervisors and the Marin City issue. That's a good observation. We are all kind of watching to see how these housing debates and legislation are going to be moving forward at the city level. The other question that she asked.
Can I just say that related to that, I think, is that you know, there is a right now, Governor Newsom has actually has put forth some legislation around single-family zoning and reducing single-family zoning in California. So it may be that no matter what local officials decide to want to do, that's going to happen or be done for them. So I just wanted to interject that. Sorry, I realized.
Thank you. That's helpful. I've been watching that news story with interest because I think that's going to change the face of the Bay Area, and I think that's going to add some housing. Marguerite had one more question. How do we get more people involved? The people who have been the beneficiaries of white privilege, especially. Any thoughts, Omar or Carolyn? Either one of you can kind of dive into that.
I think Omar was already jumping in on it, so I'm going to let you, because it's all about involvement and active, political activism and so on. So I feel like you already started to flesh that out pretty nicely.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's, I would just continue advocating for more civic participation in these issues, right? Really learning at the local level what you city council members and you mayor are doing around affordable housing. all cities and towns need to update the housing element by January 23, right? So this year and next year is going to be a lot of movement around the housing element. And that is going to be the space that we talk about priorities, use of the land, regulations, things that have been blocking housing development, things that have been blocking affordable housing. So that's going to be an opportunity to participate, right? In MCFL, there is going to be a group. I think each city has to create an advisory or steering committee to talk about it. You should be reaching out to your city and say, okay, I would love to participate. I want to make sure that I'm there, right? Advocating for what you think is right for your communities and for your cities. Usually elected officials get to hear the voices of the people that don't want to change anything, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's more progressive voices out there than the ones that are against it, but sometimes they don't join us those 2-3 hour meetings at the city hall, right? I know they are boring, but we need to be there because I think that is the opportunity. Being more engaged at the civic level, that's one of the easy things to do.
Thank you so much.
I did hear somebody say at one of our conferences one time that elected officials are the enemy of affirmatively furthering fair housing. He said, I know it's not a popular opinion, but he said that the tendency is for our elected officials to want to maintain the status quo. And it's related to what Omar was just saying, was just talking about. And that is, of course, the hope is that when you elect somebody, that they're going to make the kinds of progressive changes that we want of them, but that there's very strong pull to not rock the boat and make changes.
Right, that inertia where it's so much easier to listen to those voices that are saying everything's fine, stay the course, than it is to actively work towards fighting against some of these inequities. The next question that I have is from David. Is there a specific countywide affordable housing plan proposal that's out there that any of the panelists would like to point out? Or anything you guys want to highlight that's in the works or that people should be aware of?
Do you mean in terms of actual developments that have been proposed, or I'm not quite sure? Because what I was going to say is that what I was talking about with the RENA allocations, that is, this mix of affordable of different housing types and so on. And the one thing I will just say is that that you can each jurisdiction can specify, of the affordable housing that the number of affordable housing units that they are committed to, how many of those are going to be available to low-income people, how many to very low-income people, or extremely low-income people, right? Because the people who have the least, it may be that the affordable housing that is being developed is out of their reach, right? So you have to make sure that there's some sense of like inclusion and inclusivity in how those things get allocated. And once again, that means being involved, understanding what's happening at the city or county level around what those allocations look like. I didn't mention this, but in Marin County, there were 10 jurisdictions out of 28 in California who appealed their RENA allocations, and 10 out of those 28 were from Marin County jurisdictions. So, I mean, that's a big proportion of the number. Now, I know that there was a big racial equity lens that was, so it was the number of units that were assigned to Marin County was increased dramatically because they were looking at it through this racial equity lens. But anyway, that becomes very important to see like how this plays out and how these sites are developed. I mean, I was just looking at an article about huge hubbub around this affordable housing site that is being developed in Mill Valley, and how up in arms people are around like Friends of Hockey Park, Save Hockey Park, and so on. These. I'm not saying that there aren't real issues that you have to get around, and that people don't have appropriate concerns, but I think the idea is not whether we do this but how we do it. What's the best way of building affordable housing, so that we are addressing issues around drought and thinking about how you deal with the drought and the fact that we have few water hookups and so on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. David asks if you could add the website to the RHNA, information about what that is about, so that we can further educate ourselves. And I'll include whatever website you add, I'll include that into the book list and resources, so that people can also take a look at that. The next question that I had was from, sorry, I'm trying to do these in order, Liesel. She says, for Omar, can you talk more about the Canal Alliance's initiatives around affordable housing in the canal? I'm sorry. I had heard that the organization was exploring forming an LLC to purchase buildings and to preserve them as affordable housing. Can you share a little bit about that, Omar?
Of course. So Canal Alliance own properties. We are a property owner. We own 3 buildings, 12 units, and a small contribution to the problem. And last year, the board and the staff made a decision to convert the affordable housing into an organizational strategy, meaning it becomes a formal program. And what we are looking at is expanding what we had until that point, which is the acquisition of existing properties to rehabilitate them and then convert them into affordable housing. So that's the model. So we're looking at right now, looking for any property that is in the canal, located in the canal, that goes to the market. We are trying to negotiate with the existing owners to sell those properties to Canal Alliance. It's a very complicated time, and it's a very complicated market, to be honest. But that's what we are trying to do as an organization. Also, is getting more experience on real estate. So then development can be the next thing for us, to be involved. We are following the steps of 2 organizations in the Bay Area. They went through the same process that we are going through. One of them is Meta in San Francisco and the Mission. Now they are one of the major housing developers and affordable housing agencies. And the other one is Unity Council in Oakland, also a major developer. So they went through the same path that we are going right now, acquiring existing properties, getting more familiar with property management, with real estate, and then start building a political capital in that area to prevent gentrification, because that's the risk. I'm sure that you follow the local news. The bowling alley is a huge property. It's not going to be a bowling alley anymore, and has been conversations to use that space for market rate housing. And those are the type of projects that can really start changing neighborhoods. And we need to make sure that if there is an opportunity to build, to change the use of the land, if there is an opportunity to build housing, we as a group, as a society, need to define what type of housing do we really need? How do we want to use that space? If we want to add density, it has to be in an intentional way to resolve existing problems, not to build more $1 million homes or whatever they're trying to do there, right?
Excellent. Yeah, that's an excellent point. If are we working to keep things the same, or are we working to improve the situation? So I think that is an excellent point. I'm just ticking along through the questions here. What is SURJ doing to promote affordable housing? Lisa, I'm actually going to throw that one your way if you would like to join the conversation.
Happy to. Yeah, SURJ has just formed a housing working group, and we have spent 2 days in retreat to decide what our, come to collaboration on our values, our priorities, and our strategies. And so what we are seeing is that there's a great need for education and disruption and alliances to be formed to move the needle here in Marin, because we are willing to have conversations that other groups may not. This is our work, quite frankly. So we are going to be leaning into conversations about housing, particularly through the lens of racial justice. So look for that to come. And we're just getting started. So that's my answer.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm still going through the questions here. Just to note, Carolyn has added in a couple of websites about the RHNA if you want to open that up. The final point is, and it looks like Marguerite mentioned this, is, you know, part of the problem is we have 17 people in this room. I think 80 people registered, close to 80 people registered, and 17 showed up. We are going to be sending out a recording of this, but it's a little, having people take the step to make these actions that change the situation. It starts small with attending something like this, attending, you know, your city council meetings, being that voice that says, I want everyone to benefit, everyone to do well. I want everyone to grow in my community, and having those conversations, amplifying that, sharing that viewpoint with your friends, I think is a huge first step. So we are actually past time. I know that this conversation is so good. Please remember, this is a series. We will be talking more. You'll probably see our panelists again in some of our future future programs. So I thank you guys so much for showing up, Omar and Carolyn, for sharing that with you. Some closing housekeeping. We have action items. There's action items. Can actually, Lisa, can you put some of those action items into the chat for everyone so that they can see? We have a resource list, as I mentioned before. There are different things that we'll also be emailing this information out, just for you guys to know as well. The land, when Lisa talked about the land trust, she mentioned the Sogorete land trust to rematriate the land. That information will be emailed out to you, but she'll also put the link in the chat here. You can sign up for the Golden Gate Village updates. That is some more of the affordable housing that Marin has provided to ensure that people have a place to live in Marin. People of color have a space and a place in Marin. You can check out the Canal Alliance website. You can check out SURJ Marin and become one of the supporters and one of the participants in the work that SURJ Marin is doing. So these are all things that you can do to begin being a person of action who's working to ensure that people have housing. Barring that, and Lisa's putting that into the chat now. Thank you, all of you, for showing up. Thank you for being with us and hearing our speakers, for learning with us as we're looking at resources like a PBS's Erase the Power of an Illusion. As I said, this is a whole series, and we will be discussing more issues. Our next event is going to be November 13th. Yes, November 13th. You can register now. That is available on the Marin County website. So if you go to marincountylibrary.org/events, you should be able to register for the next one, where we're going to be discussing why is Marin so white. But I wanted to thank SURJ Marin and the Friends of the Marin County Library, Friends of the Fairfax Library specifically, who have given money to make this happen. We wanted to make sure that our speakers received some of the benefits of sharing their expertise with us. And those two organizations, as I said, partnered up to make sure that this happened. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate that you're here, and we look forward to learning with you in about 2 months. Take care, you guys, and have an excellent weekend.
Take care. Thanks for the opportunity. Bye-bye.